Welcome to the Thought Dakota's YouTube channel, also Reasonable Faith Dallas chapter. And today we have the plum pleasing pleasure to bring you the man, the myth, the legend. And many times when you hear that said, oftentimes the person isn't a legend or a myth. But today we actually have the man, the myth, the legend, none other than Dr. J.P. Moreland. How you doing today, Dr. Moreland?
Well, Sean, after that introduction, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to tell my wife that. She just started thinking of me as a legend. Maybe I wouldn't have so many things to do around the house.
Oh, wow. Me too.
It's great to be here.
I can concur. And today we just wanted to invite you back, Dr. Moreland. You've been gracious to come on to the channel 3 times, and this is your 3rd time. And today we want to just let you rip, let you loose. And we have different channels connected. We have the Reasonable Faith Dallas chapter channel is connected. The Thought Dakota page is connected. The debate forum is connected. And my personal page is connected. So today, guys, if you tune in, this is a once in a lifetime treat. And we have one of the top scholars in Christian apologetics. He's definitely one of my heroes in philosophy more generally, and then especially in Christian philosophy in particular. He's been doing this. You can look up his name, and he's an expert. He's a metaphysician, and he specializes in the philosophy of mind. And you just really can't put Dr. Moreland in the box, because he just he seems to know a lot about it, a lot of different branches of philosophy, and it's just really amazing to have him with us. So, Dr. Moreland, today our topic is, does the soul exist? And we just want to let you talk, and then closer to the end, we want to go for about an hour. I want to respect your time. And then closer to the end, whenever you stop, we'll begin the questions. And if those of you who are tuning in, please ask questions. This is a very important topic about the soul. And Dr. Moreland, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. This subject is actually quite important for a whole host of reasons. One of them, it turns out to be the existence of consciousness and the soul, if they really are non-physical, can provide evidence that there is a supreme being, a God. And it goes like this. If you say in the beginning were the particles or the strings or matter of some sort, and the history of the world is just how those particles rearrange to form larger conglomerations of particles, then it will be impossible to explain how you can have consciousness originate from nothing, from materials that don't even have the potential for consciousness. So if you have in the beginning was the Logos, then you have an easy explanation for the origin of consciousness, because your fundamental being or your fundamental entity already possesses consciousness. And that could be possessed subsequently in beings that in some way resemble that fundamental being. So the issue here is really important, and I think it's also important because a lot of people today in our society have come to believe that science, especially the hard sciences, are really the only sure and steady guide to what's real. And philosophy is kind of what you do late at night when you've had a few beers, and you just are shooting the bull and nobody knows anything, but it's fun. To illustrate that, I think I may have mentioned this to you once, but a few years ago, I was invited by a research biologist whom I did not know to go to the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and give a lecture on the soul. And so I did. And there were about 135 neuroscientists, research biologists, top psychiatrists, and so on in the audience. And there may have been a few Christians, but it was largely a non-Christian audience. And I made the argument that when it comes to the nature of consciousness and whatever it is that possesses it, neuroscience has almost nothing to say about it. Neuroscience is not equipped by its methods to do much by way of addressing what exactly is consciousness. But so the topic actually turns out to be philosophical and even theological. And I got no pushback in about a 40-minute Q&A time. And so I think it's important for our friends listening to realize that this question is not resolvable by science. It's a distinctively philosophical, and I would even say theological question. And so what I'll do is spend a little bit of time just kind of talking about what a soul is, if that's okay, and then maybe give some reflections as to why it makes sense to believe in such a thing. There are really kind of two definitions of the soul that have been rivals down through history. And one of them would be a Platonic or a Cartesian, Descartes definition. And that would say that the soul is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and unifies it. So it contains and unifies consciousness. And that's what the soul does. So the soul is that which possesses consciousness and gives it unity. And we'll talk about that later. Now, another view, which I actually favor, traces back to Aristotle and runs through Aquinas and people like that. And that's really to say that the soul is a substance or a substance-like thing, sometimes called a substantial form, that is immaterial, and it contains the powers of consciousness, and it animates the body and enlivens the body. And so the difference is that for the Thomistic view, it is the soul that grounds the living functions of the body and makes it living. So that if the soul leaves the body, it's really not a body any longer. It's just a corpse. So the body on this view is a soul matter complex. And the soul is what kind of informs it or diffuses it. For the Cartesian, like Richard Swinburne, the body is just a physical machine. That's what it is. But in either case, a soul is a immaterial substance that contains the powers of our conscious life and perhaps animates and enlivens the body. So that would be a pretty widely accepted understanding of the soul. Why should we believe in such a thing? And so let me just run down some reasons for this, and then what we can do is open it up for questions and take pushback or whatever we want. I think the first argument that I would give involves something called the problem of divisibility and the unity of consciousness. So those are slightly different but related. So let's take the problem of divisibility. It seems like persons or selves, if you want to call it that, are all or nothing kind of things. I mean, there's either a person there or there isn't. It doesn't seem to make any sense to say that there is 85% of a person there. Or you could take the person and divide them into two, and you would have two half persons. That just doesn't seem to be a plausible thing. If I have time, let me illustrate that. Suppose that we had some person, we'll call him P1, and we're getting ready to operate on him. What we're going to do is we're going to cut him right down the middle so that there are two perfectly carved out, exactly resembling left and right halves, same mass, same weight, and we split them right down the middle. Now, there are two rooms down both hallways where there's a half of a brain and body lying on an operating table in one room, and a half of a brain and a body in another room down the hall. So we take P1, split him in half, take half of his brain and body down to this one room, and surgically fuse it with the half brain and body waiting for that. And we do the same thing with this other half. So now what we get are two, we might just call them new people that wake up after surgery, and we'll just call them P2 and P3. Now, the question that we want to ask is, what happened to P1? Now, let me say something else about P2 and P3, okay? It turns out that they both have exactly resembling personality traits, memories, psychological values, and senses of humor as P1 did. So both of them are exactly like P1 in their psychological traits. So, okay. Well, where did P1 go? Well, here we don't actually, I don't think we know. One solution would be that when we carved him in half, when we did the operation, he went out of existence. He's out of there. And P2 and P3 are two brand new people, but they both share P1's psychological profile, his memories and so on. That's one option. Second option is P1 did survive and he's P2. But P3 is a brand new person, but just happens to have exactly the same psychological traits as P1 surviving in P2. Option 3, P1 survives in P3, so P1's still around and he is identical to P3, but this P2 guy is brand new and has his exact same psychological traits. Okay, now here is it's obvious that P1 can't be the same as identical to P2 and P3 both. And the reason is P2 and P3 are two different people. They're talking about different things. They're not, one's eating lunch, the other one isn't, so they can't be the same. They're two completely different people. So P1 certainly can't be both of them. Now, maybe somebody would say, well, what about this? P1 is one half of P2 and one half of P3. So he did survive, but he is half of P1 and half of P3. Now, does that make any sense? Well, no, and here's why. Suppose that we told P1 before the surgery, I have good and bad news. The good news is after surgery, we are going to take one of the two survivors, P2 or P3, and we're going to give him $1 million and send him on vacation to Hawaii for 2 weeks and give him a chance to live it up. But the other person, we're going to put in a dungeon and rip his fingernails off and torture him. Now, I think if that were to happen, P1 would have a reason to be worried, because it's going to be a feast or famine for him. But one thing he's not going to worry about is this. After the surgery, his visual field is going to have two halves to it. And the left half of his visual field is going to be experiencing a beach on Hawaii. And the other half of his visual field will be experiencing having his fingernails ripped off. He won't be simultaneously halfway experiencing each, because persons aren't capable of being existing as halves or as 70%. And so what this thought experiment says is that option really isn't true, isn't a real option. Because persons aren't divisible. They're either all or nothing. You can't have a half a person or 75% of a person. Now think about a table or any material object. You can divide that in half. Think about the brain and body of P1, right? We know exactly where they are, where it is. Half of it's down in that room and half of it's in that room. Take a table and divide it in half. Where's the original table? Well, half of it's over there, half of it's over. There's no problem with that, but that doesn't work with people. You take a brain, there are operations where person loses 55% of his brain or 20. When they wake up, they're not 45% of a person or 80% of a person. And there's a syndrome called Dandy-Walker syndrome. You can look it up online. Where, are you ready for this? People with this disease have 10% of a brain. If you look at an X-ray of their brain, there is a very thin, just centimeter or so sheath of brain tissue around the inside of the skull, and the entire inside of the skull is a sack of fluid. Now, are they 10% of a person? No. Now, in these operations, they lose some functioning, but the Dandy-Walker person still functions about 75% normal. So what I'm suggesting is that persons are not capable of existing as a percentage. You can't have 73% of a person, but you can have 73% of any physical object like a brain and a body. So it follows that I can't be a material object. Since I am not divisible in my being, I might be divisible in my functioning. If I'm having multiple personalities or something, but my very self isn't divided. So I think one of the things that's true about me is that I'm not capable of being divided or existing as a percentage. Is true of all the relevant physical objects like my brain and my body and my nervous system. And so I can't be them, or I'm in general not a physical object. Now, the only real live option in the history of philosophy for what I could be would be something simple. That is, and it would be something that's conscious and simple. And by simple, I mean, it's not an aggregate of parts that you could break down and like a table, and you could put the leg over there and that leg over there and the top. I do have a multiplicity of properties. And I do have what we might call a multiplicity of modes. These are what some people call like my faculty of mind and my faculty of will. Those are different. But I'm a non-aggregate, Sean. I'm not made of I'm not a heap of parts connected by the laws of nature, like a rock or something of that sort, because they can be divided and exist as a percentage. So that's the first argument that I would advance. Now, a related argument is that at any one moment, my conscious life is fundamentally unified. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Suppose that I'm looking at two horses, a brown and a black horse, trotting next to one another. Now, my conscious awareness will have what it is like to be aware of the brown horse, and there will also be a what it's like to be aware of the black horse. Okay, so far so good. Just like there's a what it's like to feel pain, or there's a certain what it's like to taste a lemon, and so on. But there's also a what it is like to see the black and the brown horse taken together as one unified experience. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Now, right now in my visual field, I'm seeing you on the screen and the rest of my computer, and I'm aware of the pictures on my desk and the whole half of my office.
Mm.
But I experience them all as unified into one whole experience. There is a what it is like to be aware of all of these things at once.
Mm.
That's what I mean, that they're unified. But there is no particular place in my brain that is activated by the light waves that come off my lamp, the light waves that come off your picture, that come off my coffee mug, because those all go to different places. Now, why?
Mm.
Well, because any physical object that is complex, that's made of parts, when it does a function, like a car performs a function of going down the road, it does that by assigning different functions to different parts. So the spark plugs will perform one function, and the drive shaft will perform another, and so on. So that the sum of all those functions adds up to the function of driving down the road. But that is, you can break that down into all these individual functions that each of the parts play. Well, that's not what, you can't do that to my visual field. It's not reducible to a bunch of parts. It's a unity. It's irreducible. But my brain, the brain activity that's going on while I'm having that one unified experience, is a billion of different little parts doing their own thing. Did you know that we've actually discovered now that when you look at a chest of drawers, there is one region of your brain that is activated with regard to the shape, another with regard to the size, another with regard to the color, another with regard to whether it's in motion or at rest, and another with regard to its distance from your body. So your brain breaks the thing down into different features. There is nothing in the brain that unifies and brings them back together into an experience of one unified chest of drawers. The brain cannot do that because it's made of parts. So the only other candidate to explain why my conscious experiences at any given moment are one and unified and totalized is that the thing that's having them isn't composed of parts. It's a simple conscious being of some kind, and that's what a soul is. So I think the unity issue and the divisibility issue are important, and the brain and the body are just not capable because they're complex entities of explaining those. Two other quick ones, and then I'll let us have some questions if you'd like. But one of them is the problem of having what I call common sense free will. It's called libertarian freedom, and I think most people commonsensically believe that if they're responsible for something, then they must have had to do it freely. They couldn't have been determined by things outside their control to do it. That would rob you of responsibility. And so we have, when I act, I have the power to do that act or to withhold and refrain. And I'm not determined either way. The problem is that if I'm an ordinary sized physical object, then my actions are completely determined through time by the laws of chemistry and physics and the inputs that come into my brain from the outside, light waves and so on. So through time, my behaviors are determined. Now you may say, well, what about quantum indeterminacy? But that's not going to help for one reason. I can't get free will by having my actions be random. That doesn't give me responsibility any more than having them determined does. So that won't work. The other problem is that it's probably true that at the macro level of ordinary sized objects, determinism or something very close to it rules. So the ordinary sized things like the brain and body are strictly determined since they're material objects. They don't behave freely. Another problem is that ordinary sized objects, as you know, Sean, are composed of parts, cells, atoms, and molecules. And physical wholes are determined in their behavior by the behaviors of the parts that build them up and compose them. And so if I were my brain or my body, I would not have the power of free choice. I would be whatever the result of causal inputs and the laws of chemistry and physics. But I know for a fact that occasionally I act freely, at least, and I'm just aware of it. So if you can't explain freedom if I'm my brain or my body, but I know that I have it. I'm aware that sometimes I could have refrained from doing what I did, and I chose to act. If that's true, then I can't be a strict material object. I've got to be some other kind of thing that transcends the laws of physics and chemistry. And a good candidate for that is I'm a soul of some kind. Now here's the final argument, and then we'll go with this as you want to. If I am the same thing as my brain or my body, then whatever is true of me will be true of my brain and body, because I'm identical to my brain. Let's just say my brain or my body, doesn't matter. If I can find one thing that's true of me that's not true of my brain and body, or one thing that could possibly be true of me, but it couldn't even possibly be true of my brain and body, then I can't be my brain and body. Because there's something possibly true of me. I have the potential for something that my brain and body don't even have the potential for. So I have a potentiality, my brain and body doesn't, so we can't be the same thing. Now here's the deal. I claim that everyone is aware that disembodied existence, that at death, the idea that I leave my brain and body behind and I exist in a disembodied state, everybody, I believe, knows that idea is at least possible. Even if it's not true, it could be. Now, what's my evidence for that? Well, huge audiences watch Dateline NBC or 2020 if they're going to have a show on assessing the near-death experience claims. And people love to watch shows like that. So they tune in and they watch people give testimonies about their NDEs, and they look at neuroscientists and others who argue for and against them, and so on. But here's what they all have in common. Even if they approach a show like that and say, you know what, I don't believe any of this stuff has happened. I'm a radical skeptic. I think when you're dead and you're out of here. But I will be willing, I'm skeptical, but I'm at least willing to listen to the evidence. I don't think it's going to be good, but if it is, I'll be persuaded. I want to hear the evidence that they present on the show. Okay, now Gary Habermas and Peter Kreeft debated Michael Shermer, Victor Stenger, and Keith Parsons on life after death. It's a long debate, about 4 hours. It was Friday night and Saturday morning in New Orleans. This happened years ago. Now, here was what I found curious, and I pointed it out to the three atheists. All of them were willing to allow the evidence to settle the question about whether there is life after death. And all three of them bet their case on the fact that the evidence wasn't good enough. Are you with me? Now, what that told me was that those three atheists, just like the people who watch Dateline NBC, are willing to admit that disembodied life after death is at least possible. It's possible. Even if it's never true, it's at least possible. How do I know they think it's at least possible? Because they're willing to see what the evidence is. Now compare that with a show on Dateline NBC featuring archaeologists who claimed to discover a cave filled with square circles in Montana. Well, nobody's going to watch that because I don't have to wait to hear the evidence for and against that discovery. Why? Because I know ahead of time there just ain't no such thing. And how do I know that? Because the envisioned objects are logically and metaphysically contradictory. You can't have square circles. So evidence isn't how I decide this is false. It's the contradictory nature of this that makes it what? Impossible.
Impossible.
The fact that people are willing to allow the evidence to settle the issue shows that they're acknowledging that this might be true. Existence is at least metaphysically possible, even though it's probably not true. Well, guess what that shows? That doesn't show that there's a life after death just from the fact that it's possible, but it does show that I'm not a physical object. Because if it's possible that I could exist without any material object existing, including my brain and body, when it's not even possible that a material object like my brain and body could exist without being physical, I don't know what it would be if it weren't physical, then there's something true about me. I have at least the potentiality for disembodied existence. No physical object has the potentiality to exist non-physically. What does it even mean to say a physical object could exist in a non? It seems like physical objects, by their very nature, are physical. So what that tells me is not that life after death is true, but that I am a soul. I'm not my body and brain, because there's something true of me that's not true of my body or brain or any other physical object. Namely, I have a certain potentiality they lack. I have the potential to at least, it might be that I exist disembodied. So these are some arguments that I think show that I can't be my brain or my body or a physical object. And all neuroscience can show, Sean, is that when I'm in my body, there's a dependency between me and my brain and body and vice versa. If I were in a car and I was strapped into the driver's seat and that strap was locked and the doors were locked, so I could not get out of the driver's seat, but there was gas in the car, I could still drive around town. But if something happened to the steering wheel, so it would only turn left and not right, that would limit what I could do. But that wouldn't prove I was the car. That would be consistent with the idea that while I'm in the car, my ability to function depends on the parts of the car working. When I'm in my body, If my brain or my eyeballs or whatever it might be are not working, I'm not going to be able to see or think, because you use your brain to think, but the brain doesn't think. I do. My eyes don't see. I do. But I use these bodily organs as tools of the soul, just like a driver uses the car to get around town. So that's all neuroscience can do, is show that when you're in the car depends on the driver doing things, and the driver depends on the car working. But if you can get out of the car, there's no dependency any longer, and they're not the same thing. So that's my two cents.
Wow, that those were like philosophical AK-47 where you just
Well, thank you.
So to recap then, at the beginning you set out two different views for the soul. One is the Aristotelian view. Is that hylomorphism?
Yes, that would be the Aristotelian and Thomistic view. Yes.
Okay, and then what was the first one? What
it
would be
was
the name of the first
Cartesian.
one?
It was Descartes. The Cartesian,
Okay.
Yeah, called the Cartesian dualism view.
Okay, and does the hylomorphism include the idea of unification of experience?
Yes, because
Okay.
it would be the soul understood as a particular substantial form or a substance-like thing that is required to unify. Because on that view, the substantial form or the soul isn't a complex object built up of parts.
Mm-hmm.
It's a simple thing, although it has different powers and properties within it, but those aren't the same thing as like a heap of sand that's a collection of parts that you could take out of the heap and they'd still exist. Take the parts of a car. If you took them all out of the car and scattered them across a playing field, they would still exist. So they don't depend on the car for their existence. But the different faculties of the soul or the substantial form, like the mind and will and so on, they can't exist outside of the soul. They're kind of dependent. They're the whole's prior to the modes there rather than the other way around. With the car, the parts are prior to the whole. So they're different. One's an aggregate, the other's a true substance or substance-like entity.
Okay. And so how would you distinguish between the Cartesian view and the hylomorphism? Is it the animation idea?
Yes. There's a little more than that, but and the reason I say that is because there's so many different versions of hylomorphism. But the bottom line is that most hylomorphists will claim that the substantial form and the soul are just two different words for the same thing. And it is capable of, in the human being, surviving the death of the body. And there are different ways they take that. But yes, and it is what unifies consciousness and unifies and grounds our living powers of the biologically living powers. Whereas the Cartesian doesn't want to have anything to do with that. It's all about consciousness for the Cartesian.
So life was a product of the body for the Cartesian view?
Exactly. I think, therefore I am, not I live, therefore I am. Whereas the Thomist, the hylomorphicist would say either I'm conscious, therefore I am. That's what Descartes meant by think. He meant conscious. Or they'd be willing to say I'm living. I'm alive, therefore I am, because they thought it was the soul that grounded life. So, yeah.
And so that explains how I've often heard some scientists, one biochemist, he recently said if you took all the parts that goes into a cell all the chemicals you needed, all the proteins and all of those, and you put them in a bucket, you still don't have a cell. And so he was trying to say that life, what makes it an actual living cell, there's still something different that biologists cannot point to. They can't analyze, okay, well, what's the difference between these two cells? One is living, one is dead, but what is this living thing? It's not
that's right.
A product of its features.
And I will tell you, a growing number of secular biologists are adopting what is sometimes called organicism, and that is that you can't reduce life to pure material biological processes. It is something that is driving those processes somehow. Yeah. So this is a minority view, but among biologists, it's growing.
Okay, and that was James Tour. I was watching a video with Dr. James Tour, and he was just
yeah, I agree with him.
And he was making that point. Okay, so the first part, you looked at two different views for the soul, Cartesian views and the Thomistic Aristotelian view. Then the second part was you looked at the problems of divisibility and unification. With divisibility, the thought experiment was that imagine you have a person, you cut that person in half, but there are two, and he's in some type of medical facility, and there are also two rooms next to the room that he's in. You take one of the halves, and there's another body that is split in half in the next room, and you put one of the halves from P1 with the half of the body that's in P2.
Yes.
And you put those two halves together, and then you take the other half of P1 and the half that's in P2 that's remaining, and you put that in room 3, and that's P3.
Yeah.
So basically, rooms 2 and 3 have the same bodies. There's just not. It's just half of the one body. So it's two bodies.
Yes.
And those two bodies are split into halves.
Yes.
And then now you have what do you want to say? 4 halves.
Yeah, and exactly. And we would have then 2 brand new unified bodies that didn't exist by combining 2 halves together. Both the P2 and P3 wake up and have the same personality and psychological traits as P1. And so this raises the question, well, where the heck is P1? And again, I'm glad you brought this up, Sean, because let me explain. We know all the physical facts. There's not a single physical fact about this thing we don't know. We know all the physical facts about P1's body. We know exactly. Suppose we had a God's eye view of this. We know where every atom and every particle in the left half of his body is. It's down in the room where P2 is. And we know where every atomic particle and organ and everything of the other half of his body is. That's in that room over there. We also know all the psychological facts because we know that the psychological traits that P1 had, his personality, his goals in life, his values, what he liked and didn't like, are exactly shared by P2 and P3. Now, if here's the conclusion, I wish I'd have put this way, and I'm glad you're raising this. Given that we know all the physical facts and all the psychological facts about the situation, the physical facts are half there and half there. The psychological facts are exactly alike in both rooms. We still don't know where P1 is, but there is something happened to him. He either popped out of existence or he's the guy in piece P2 or P3. So if there is a fact about P1, but it can't be captured by the physical facts or the psychological facts, then there must be facts that make P1 who he is beyond his physical nature and his psychological characteristics. And that's going to be a self or an I or a soul or whatever you want to call it. That is what would answer the question, where is P1? He's wherever his soul is or his self is, but we don't know that because all we know are facts about the psychology and the body. And that doesn't tell us where he is. So there's more to him than his body and his psychological traits. He's the thing that has them.
So let me ask you this. Why is there reason to think that if you did have two bodies and you split those bodies,
start it again,
and right, is there okay, is there reason to think that P2 and P3, why even think they would be the same, because you had two bodies there, right? So presumably the two people who there was once a person in each body. So how do you determine which person the person would be if you cut both halves? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the way you solve that is just to say that you actually only have a half a body in one room, and it belonged to some person named Joe. And then you have a half of another person's body, Smith. You don't have a person you split their body in half and put it in the two rooms. You have two half bodies from two different people. And when you cut those people in half, they died. And so now you've got two dead half corpses that are given half bodies of P1, and then there's revived. The pads are put on them, and whoop, it comes back to life. And they both sound like P1. They remember playing basketball when he did and all the rest of it. And you're sitting there thinking, where the heck's P1? And you don't have a clue. Nobody does. Maybe he's out of here. I don't know.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't even see a reason why let's say that let's call P1 star.
Okay.
The second body that was cut in half.
Okay.
Why not think that the person who was revived why not think P2 and P3 is the person who was P1 star? You see what I'm saying? Like, who determines which person's personality, or is that just a given from the thought experiment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, in other words, why is that person who wakes up down there in P2's room not the person that gave that half of the body instead of P1?
Right.
Yeah. I think it's because the person who wakes up doesn't have any of that person's personality. I mean, that guy liked baseball and now he's dead, but P1 hated baseball. He was a football lover. So I think it would, first of all, be that, even though if all we had to go on with a body, it'd be 50-50. I mean, I don't know. But I think if you take in the psychology, that would tip the scales in favor of P1 instead of P2. But the truth of the matter is, we don't even know if it's P1 because it could just be a psychological double of some kind. Because P3's got he likes the same things P2 does. But it couldn't be the original guys because the person doesn't have their psychology or personality. And the other thing is you just stipulate it. You say, well, those guys, so let's just say that they're out of here now. Let's worry about P1. But it was a good question.
Okay. So I guess the other thing is, would you say that the materialists, that when we take a step back and we think about what we're doing in this conversation, that the materialist has to explain consciousness in terms of parts?
Yeah.
And so by in the first argument, you're showing that you can divide parts, but you can't. But the person doesn't seem to have this quality of being divisible.
Exactly right.
Therefore,
Exactly.
you can't explain consciousness in terms of parts because they don't have the same properties.
Exactly. That's
So 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 in other words, they have no explanation. It's not as though, look, here's my explanation. No, you don't have any explanation.
no, and what they have there are attempts to try to get out of this, but they just seem like, you know how sometimes people will kind of come up with things just to avoid a conclusion, whereas other times they come up with some. I mean, there really seem to be pretty good points. In this case, it feels like the former. I mean, you know, the attempts to kind of patch their view up, to me, don't make much sense. And so I think this is a big problem. I think.
Oh, I'm absolutely loving this. And so the second argument is that let's say we do have consciousness. Let's grant that we have material parts and we have consciousness. Now, there is no mechanism by which a certain number of parts can account for the unification of consciousness, because in our conscious experience, we don't experience things as, oh, this eye right here is just, oh, I see only the black on this pad, but this eyeball sees the light and now, you know.
Exactly.
But we experience consciousness as one unified whole, like it's one thing. It's not a bunch of different things. It's one thing.
It's not a bunch of little atomic pieces of consciousness that are all kind of connected together like atoms are. Our consciousness isn't atomistic. It's not a collection of little parts of consciousness. It's holistic. There is what it is like to be in my total conscious state at one time. There isn't just what it's like to see this lamp and that cup or whatever. There's also, over and above that, a unified what it's like to have all these together into oneself. I mean, and how do you? That's just a holism that can't be accounted for if you begin with an atomic understanding of the brain and as it is understood, because they study it in terms of the neurons and the calcium ions and the different parts and so on. So I think atomism is just a non-starter.
Right. So, but they can account for, let's say they can account for the parts, but they can't explain the fact that we experience it as a unified whole.
Yeah, only a simple self can explain that adequately.
Wow. And so what do they have anything that they use to try to explain?
Yeah, one thing they try to do is to appeal to something called synchronicity, and that means that we experience a unified consciousness because a whole bunch of our neurological networks and parts are all firing at the same time in the same state. But like one of my friends said, well, that's like saying that we have 10 chefs in 10 different buildings, and they're all making the same entree at the same time. And that's going to explain the unified experience of one chef making an entree in and of himself. That's not going to explain anything. You can't explain why one chef experiences a unified awareness of the chicken he's cooking by saying that, well, he really is actually 10 different chefs all cooking a chicken in different places at the same time. That's not going to help anything.
Right. So they did this. So that move is to point to the same explanation of the things that they can explain, which are the individual factors. But that's not what needs to be explained. We need to explain why we're having this one unified experience.
Right.
So pointing to particular explanations of individual, well, we can explain the shape of this chicken by this chef and Well, that's not what we need to explain. We need to explain why is it's all one cohesive picture of reality. And then, so then the next argument that you gave was an argument for free will. We seem to have the common sense view, naive intuition is that most people, we have free will. But on materialism, if all we are is just atoms in the void, just bumping into each other, wave particles or whatever, strings, if that's all we are, then first of all, there's no we. Because even it seems like even the word we presupposes this unification.
I agree. I don't think that you can even use the word I if I'm not a unified self. I'm not a collection.
Right.
I have a simple subject of action and consciousness and deliberation and all the rest of it. You're right. And that's another argument that I didn't cover, but you're right. That's a legitimate. Okay. Yeah. You're onto a legitimate argument.
So if that's all we are, then freedom at best is illusory.
It is illusory.
So so there is no freedom. It's just, but this intuition, this impression that we have freedom counts as strong evidence, observational facts that must be explained.
Well, and that's right. Not explained away. And so, you can have compatibilist freedom, meaning that I'm free even though I'm totally determined by factors outside my control. But I think most people, when they hear that, are going to say, you know what, that's really not freedom. I'm sorry.
Right.
That's just another form of determinism, and I'm not buying it.
That's freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Right. Yeah, there you go. And if I'm a physical object, it's hard to see how I could have the common sense kind of freedom that I'm aware that I have. You know the difference between an active thought and a passive thought. A passive thought is where you're a patient, you're a receiver, and another person puts a thought in your mind through language or whatever, but you're receiving thoughts, okay? That has a different feel to it when you choose to direct your thinking on a new topic of your own belief. And that has an active sense of bringing it about when you say, wait a minute, I'm gonna think about lunch for a minute. I need to get that done. Well, that feels to you like it is the result of you doing something.
Yeah.
Whereas
power. You have agency there.
Yeah, but the other feels like someone's doing something to you. And I say that that's a legitimate awareness of a real difference. The only way to make sense of that is if one of them really was an active choice and the other's a passive recipient. So,
okay. Oh, you just dropped the last one. I don't even think you presented that argument. You just
you leave me alone, Sean.
That's a teaser. That was a teaser there. So, wow, it's so much here. I mean, if someone wanted to read about these arguments, are these, because I know you've worked on these, are these in your book on the soul? Are these different arguments?
Yeah, if you wanted to get just kind of an introduction to this, my book, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters, contains, I think, a readable presentation of these and other arguments that I think could be really helpful. That's a starting place, yeah.
And you also have a book on the existence of God from consciousness?
Yes.
The argument from consciousness on the existence of God. Now, is that more of a...
pretty tough. It's a pretty technical book.
Well, hey, I have some homework. I'm going to have to go through your book on the soul and then go into this argument, because I mean, wow, like it was just that was so good. That was great. And I know anyone who's watched this show today, they have an outline. Like, this is something you can do some work on if you want to just take one of these arguments and go to work on them.
That's right.
I think I'm going to work on like all of these arguments within my PhD program coming up. You've laid them out. I've in such a simple format that, man, it's a roadmap here. This is really valuable today. So thank you so much.
Well, Sean, it's always a joy to be with you. I've had more fun. You're just a great brother. And have me back. We'll do it some other time. I need to go now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And y'all, you have a great one.
All right.
Thank you guys for tuning in to Sean Mixon's Thought Decoder, the Reasonable Faith Dallas page, the Dallas chapter of Reasonable Faith, led by the founder, William Lane Craig. We've just had Dr. J.P. Moreland on, and he's just laid out several amazing arguments, several challenges to the materialist worldview in explaining consciousness, and the best explanation for consciousness, for the fact that consciousness doesn't seem to be divisible, and for the fact that consciousness unifies our experience, is that there is a soul there. So there's some abductive reasoning that is used to reach that conclusion, which is also used within science when you can compare competing alternatives that are seeking to explain some observable data. And in this sense, it's consciousness. He also laid out two different views for the soul, which is a Cartesian view from Rene Descartes, where the soul is just some unextended entity. It's the product of thought. But it does not give life to the body. The body may be able to capable of having life within itself. And the hylomorphism view, where the soul is that which gives life to the body, and it's also unextended. He gave an argument from free will for the existence of the soul. We seem to have freedom within our experience, but if materialism is true, we don't have freedom. Therefore, it's a indication that the soul must exist, that there must be this entity that is beyond the materialistic world, that is the thing that explains our freedom. So it's not clear the argument form for that argument, but just go back through. This is something like, if you're a serious student of philosophy and of apologetics, you can go back and take these arguments and lay them out. I'll do another show where we go through these arguments, but thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for your time. And remember to always think better. This is Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder.